Ladies and gentlemen, there is a peculiar power in the sight of one who walks alone. This image of a woman who treads a path not shared by husband or earthly companion has the capacity to unsettle and inspire in equal measure. And why not? For solitude has always been a thing both revered and feared. We are told, are we not, that man was not made to be alone. Yet there is a profound difference between solitude and isolation. Solitude, when chosen, becomes a crucible for transformation. Isolation, when imposed, becomes a burden to bear. This woman who walks her path without the steadying arm of a husband is not lost in isolation. Rather, she has embraced solitude as a wellspring of strength. In a world that rushes to categorize and define, there lies a peculiar danger in the reduction of a person's identity to the roles they fill. It is as though society clutches at the visible markers of one's life, titles, relationships, or affiliations, and proclaims, "Here is the whole of who you are," yet the truth is far more profound and unsettling. The human soul, infinite in its complexity, cannot be confined to the narrow boundaries of such roles. Identity, in its truest form, is not bestowed by culture, nor dictated by circumstance, but is anchored in something far beyond the transient whims of mortal understanding. Consider for a moment the prevailing sentiment that measures the worth of a woman by her attachments, particularly to a husband. While such a bond is noble, and can indeed be a source of joy, it is not the essence of personhood. To equate one's value with marital status is to mistake the frame for the masterpiece. It is as though one were to admire a gilded picture frame while ignoring the vibrant painting it surrounds. A woman's soul, fashioned in the image of the Creator, bears a dignity that no earthly institution, however hallowed, can either confer or diminish. This is not to dismiss the beauty of human companionship, for indeed the bonds we form are reflections of divine love. But there is a grave error in assuming that identity is dependent upon them. Such a notion places a burden upon relationships that they were never meant to bear. It implies that without a particular role to play, a person is somehow incomplete, a half-formed being waiting to be made whole. Yet this is a lie, for the fullness of a person is found not in the outward signs of their life, but in the inward reality of their being. Moreover, this obsession with categorization blinds us to the uniqueness of every individual. No two souls are alike, each bears the fingerprints of the divine in a way that is utterly unrepeatable. To insist that there is but one path to fulfillment, or one way to define success, is to flatten the rich tapestry of humanity into a dull, monotonous fabric. It is to declare that the sunrise must conform to the same pattern as the stars, or that the oak tree must apologize for not being a rose. Identity, true identity, is a gift from God, and is rooted in the eternal rather than the temporal. It is a reality that existed before the foundations of the world were laid, and will endure long after the fleeting concerns of this life have faded into memory. To discover this identity is not a matter of conforming to external expectations, but of turning inward, toward the quiet places of the soul, where the voice of the Creator can be heard. In those still and sacred moments, a woman learns not who she is expected to be, but who she was made to be. The conventions of society may insist otherwise, whispering that a woman walking alone is somehow lacking, as though the absence of a particular relationship signifies an absence of meaning. But this is to confuse the means with the end. A role, however significant, is but one thread in the grand design of a life. It is not the thread that gives the tapestry its worth, but the hand of the weaver who crafted it. There is a curious paradox in the human condition. Though we are creatures made for relationship, there is an undeniable power in the experience of solitude. It is not a power that is immediately apparent, nor is it a power that the world is quick to recognize. Indeed, many fear solitude, associating it with loneliness or loss. Yet solitude, when rightly understood and embraced, becomes a crucible in which the soul is refined, strengthened, and drawn closer to its ultimate purpose. To walk alone, whether by choice or by circumstance, is to embark on a path fraught with challenges, for there is no crowd to obscure one's flaws, no partner to share the weight of the journey. In solitude, one stands face to face with oneself, unshielded by the distractions of society. It is here, in this unvarnished confrontation with one's own nature, that true strength begins to emerge. For it is only when we cease to lean upon others that we discover the depth of our own reserves and, more importantly, the infinite source from which those reserves are replenished. The world often mistakes busyness for significance and noise for progress. In solitude, however, one is stripped of such illusions. The clamor of the outside world fades, and in the quiet the soul begins to hear truths that were previously drowned out. It is not an easy process. The silence can be deafening, and the absence of external affirmation unsettling. Yet it is in this very discomfort that growth occurs. Just as a tree must endure the barren winter to deepen its roots, so must the soul endure the seasons of solitude to strengthen its foundation. There is also a peculiar kind of courage required to walk alone. Society thrives on conformity, on the subtle and sometimes not so subtle pressure to fit within its prescribed molds. To choose solitude, or to accept it when it is thrust upon you, is to defy these expectations. It is to declare, not in arrogance but in quiet assurance, that one's worth is not dependent upon the validation of others. Such courage is not easily attained, for it requires a trust that goes beyond human understanding, a trust in the unseen, the eternal, the divine. In solitude, one learns to distinguish between the essential and the superfluous. The distractions of the world fall away, and what remains is the core of existence, the relationship between the soul and its creator. This is not to say that human relationships are unimportant, far from it. But there is a strength that comes from learning to stand alone, a strength that is not easily shaken. It is the strength of the oak that has weathered countless storms, its roots sinking ever deeper into the soil with each passing gale. Solitude also provides an unparalleled clarity of vision. When one walks alone, there is no one else to blame, no one else to depend upon. The path becomes uniquely one's own, and with it comes a heightened sense of responsibility and purpose. It is in this space, free from the noise of competing voices, that the soul can discern its calling with greater precision. The solitude that once seemed like a barren wasteland is revealed to be fertile ground, rich with the potential for growth and discovery. Strength in solitude is not merely the ability to endure isolation, it is the capacity to transform it into something beautiful and life-giving. It is the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that one's worth is not tied to external circumstances but rooted in an unchanging truth. It is the peace that arises from being fully present in the moment, unencumbered by the need to perform or please. And it is the joy that springs from the realization that even in solitude, one is never truly alone, for the presence of the Creator is always near. The notion of walking alone, particularly in a world so enmeshed in communal identities and shared experiences, often leads to the misconception that such a journey must be marked by isolation or the absence of meaningful connection. Yet this is far from the truth. For even the solitary path is not devoid of community, nor is it barren of purpose. Rather, it offers a unique opportunity to engage with the world and fulfill a calling that is often obscured by the distractions of conventional roles and relationships. Human beings are inherently relational creatures, designed to give and receive love. This is not merely a social construct, but a reflection of the divine nature itself, for God, in his triune mystery, is both unity and relationship. To walk alone, therefore, is not to reject this fundamental aspect of our nature, but to engage with it in a different and often deeper way. It is to recognize that community is not confined to the narrow definitions of family or marriage, but extends to all whom we encounter, and even to the unseen communion of saints that transcends time and space. When one walks alone, the boundaries of community often expand rather than contract. Freed from the immediate demands of a single, central relationship, the solitary soul is available to a broader array of connections. The friend, the neighbor, the stranger in need all become part of the tapestry of one's life in a way that might not have been possible otherwise. This is not a lesser form of relationship, but a broader and in some ways more inclusive one. It is a reminder that the call to love and serve is not limited by circumstance, but is a universal mandate, applicable in every season of life. Moreover, the solitary journey often clarifies one's sense of calling. In the absence of competing voices and expectations, the soul can better discern the quiet promptings of the spirit. This is not to say that the path is always clear or easy. Indeed, the absence of a defined role can sometimes feel like an absence of purpose. Yet it is precisely in this seeming void that a deeper calling often emerges, a calling that is not tied to societal norms or personal ambition, but is rooted in the eternal purposes of God. To walk alone is to be reminded that one's calling is not defined by what the world deems significant, but by what God has uniquely equipped and called each person to do. For some, this may mean serving in ways that are visible and celebrated. For others, it may mean quiet acts of faithfulness that go unnoticed by all but the one who sees all things. Regardless of the form it takes, this calling is not diminished by solitude, but is often magnified by it. Community, in its truest sense, is not a matter of proximity or shared circumstance, but of shared purpose and mutual encouragement. The solitary walker, though physically alone, is never truly isolated, for they remain part of a larger body, the body of Christ, which spans every nation, tribe, and tongue. In this context, even the smallest act of service, the quietest prayer, or the simplest gesture of kindness becomes part of something far greater than oneself. It becomes a thread in the vast and beautiful tapestry of God's redemptive work in the world. To embrace both community and calling on the solitary path is to recognize that every individual has a role to play in the grand drama of creation. This role is not contingent upon marital status, social standing, or any other external factor, but is determined by the gifts, passions, and opportunities that God has placed before each person. The solitary journey, far from being a detour or a deviation, often becomes the very stage upon which this calling is revealed and fulfilled. In this light, the solitary walker is not an anomaly or an outsider, but a vital part of the larger story. Their journey, though different in form, is no less significant or meaningful. Indeed, it often serves as a reminder to the rest of the community that our ultimate identity and purpose are found not in the roles we play or the relationships we have, but in the one who calls us by name and invites us to participate in his work of redemption. The world often presents freedom as an absence of constraints, a boundless autonomy to chart one's own course and satisfy one's own desires. Yet if we pause to reflect, we find that this so-called freedom frequently enslaves us. The pursuit of autonomy becomes a tyranny of choice, a restless striving after fleeting pleasures and illusory goals. True freedom, as paradoxical as it may seem, is not found in the rejection of all constraints, but in the willing submission to the right ones. It is only in faith that we discover a freedom that does not shackle but liberates, does not diminish but fulfills. Faith, at its core, is an act of trust not in the ephemeral promises of the world, but in the eternal promises of God. To live in faith is to relinquish the illusion of self-sufficiency and to embrace the reality that our lives are held in hands far more capable and compassionate than our own. This surrender is not a loss but a gain, for in yielding to God, we find ourselves freed from the endless burdens of self-deification and self-direction. The one who walks in faith no longer bears the weight of having to determine their own worth or chart their own destiny, for these are secure in the one who created them. There is, however, a peculiar courage required to embrace this freedom, for it flies in the face of every instinct we have to control our own lives. The world tells us that to be free is to be unbound, to have no master but oneself. Faith, on the other hand, declares that true freedom comes not from being unbound, but from being bound to that which is good, true, and eternal. It is a freedom that does not spring from independence, but from dependence on a God whose love is perfect, and whose plans are far higher than our own. This freedom in faith is not a passive state but an active one. It is not merely the absence of fear or doubt, but the presence of a deep and abiding trust that propels one forward. To walk in this freedom is to step out into the unknown, not with anxiety but with confidence, knowing that the one who leads us is both sovereign and good. It is a freedom that enables us to let go of the need to control outcomes, to strive for recognition, or to secure our own future, for we know that all these things are already secure in Christ. Faith also frees us from the tyranny of comparison. In a world obsessed with measuring worth by worldly standards, success, beauty, relationships, achievements, faith reminds us that our value is not determined by these fleeting markers. We are not defined by what we have or what we lack, by where we are or where we wish to be. Our identity is found not in the ever-shifting sands of human opinion, but in the unchanging truth of God's love. To live in this freedom is to walk with a quiet assurance, unshaken by the judgments of others or the pressures of society. Moreover, freedom in faith liberates us from the fear of failure. In the economy of the world, failure is often seen as the ultimate defeat, a mark of inadequacy or unworthiness. But in the economy of faith, failure is transformed into an opportunity for growth, a stepping stone toward deeper reliance on God. The one who walks in faith is not paralyzed by the fear of falling, for they know that even when they stumble, they are upheld by grace. This is a freedom that emboldens rather than constrains, a freedom that allows one to take risks, to dream boldly, and to live fully, knowing that their security is not in their own strength but in God's faithfulness. Faith also frees us from the need for constant validation. The one who trusts in God does not seek their worth in the fleeting applause of others, but rests in the quiet assurance of divine approval. This is not a freedom that isolates, but one that empowers, enabling us to love and serve others without the burden of seeking their affirmation. It is a freedom that allows us to give generously, forgive readily, and live joyfully, for we are no longer bound by the chains of resentment, pride, or insecurity. In faith, we find a freedom that transcends circumstances. It is not dependent on external conditions, but arises from an internal reality, a reality rooted in the unshakable truth of God's promises. This freedom is not diminished by hardship or suffering, but often shines most brightly in the midst of it. For the one who walks in faith knows that even in the darkest valley, they are not alone, and even in the face of loss, they are not without hope. To view life through the lens of eternity is to see it in its proper scale. The human condition, bound as it is by time, often fixates on the immediate and the tangible. We are preoccupied with the pressing concerns of the day, the fleeting pleasures of the hour, and the temporary trials of the moment. Yet these are but fragments of a far greater whole. Without an eternal perspective, we are like travelers who mistake a single step for the entire journey or a single note for the entire symphony. An eternal perspective does not deny the significance of the present, but imbues it with deeper meaning. When we understand that this life is but the prelude to an unending story, every moment takes on a weight and a wonder that it did not previously possess. The mundane tasks, the small acts of kindness, the quiet sacrifices, all these are seen not as insignificant gestures, but as threads in a tapestry that stretches beyond the horizons of time. What might seem trivial in the temporal becomes profound in the eternal, for every action, every word, every thought has its echoes in eternity. Consider, too, the way an eternal perspective transforms our understanding of suffering. In the absence of eternity, pain and hardship appear as cruel intrusions, senseless interruptions in an otherwise desirable existence. But when viewed in the light of eternity, suffering is not an end but a means, a tool in the hands of a master craftsman who is shaping us for purposes beyond our comprehension. This is not to diminish the reality of pain, but to place it in its proper context. The trials of this life, though grievous, are but a fleeting moment compared to the glory that awaits. An eternal perspective also reorients our priorities. How often do we find ourselves striving for things that, though valuable in the moment, hold no lasting significance. Wealth, status, accolades, these are the currencies of a world that is passing away. To live with eternity in mind is to invest in treasures that cannot be lost, to pour our energy into pursuits that will endure. It is to recognize that the applause of heaven is worth infinitely more than the fleeting approval of men. Moreover, an eternal perspective frees us from the tyranny of fear. Fear thrives on the temporal, on the belief that what is lost cannot be regained, that what is broken cannot be restored. But when we see life through the lens of eternity, we realize that no loss is final and no wound is permanent. Death itself, the great enemy, is revealed to be not an ending but a beginning, not a defeat but a doorway to a life more real and enduring than we can imagine. This perspective also deepens our appreciation for the good gifts of this life. Paradoxically, it is only when we see the temporal in light of the eternal that we can fully savor it. The beauty of a sunrise, the laughter of a friend, the joy of meaningful work, these are not mere distractions or diversions, but foretastes of what is to come. They are glimpses of a reality that is both already present and not yet fully revealed. To live with an eternal perspective is to see these gifts as signposts pointing us toward a greater glory, as whispers of a melody that will one day be played in full. An eternal perspective also compels us toward love. If this life were all there is, then love would be little more than a fleeting emotion, a temporary bond destined to be severed by time. But in the light of eternity, love takes on a permanence and a power that transcends the limits of this world. To love is to participate in something eternal, for God Himself is love, and every act of genuine care and compassion is a reflection of His nature. It is to invest in relationships that will endure, to build bridges that will not crumble, and to sow seeds that will bear fruit long after we are gone. Finally, an eternal perspective humbles us. It reminds us of our smallness in the grand sweep of history and the vastness of the universe, and yet it also assures us of our significance in the eyes of the Creator. To live with eternity in mind is to walk with both reverence and joy, to recognize that our lives, though brief, are deeply meaningful. It is to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of a great story, one authored by the one who is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. In the end, the woman who walks alone with no husband is not diminished by her solitude nor defined by the conventions of the world. She is a soul, intricately woven by the Creator, whose identity is rooted not in external circumstances, but in the eternal truth of God's love. Her strength does not lie in independence, but in the quiet courage to embrace the solitude that refines and fortifies her. She is not alone in her journey. Her community extends beyond visible ties, encompassing all who share in the higher calling to love and serve. And it is in this freedom not from responsibility, but for a greater purpose, that she finds true liberty, not constrained by worldly desires, but liberated by faith. Her perspective, informed by the eternal, allows her to see the fleeting trials of this world in their proper light, where even suffering becomes a tool of transformation, and joy is found in the simplest of acts. Her path, though at times solitary, is no less significant than any other, for it is aligned with the greater purpose of God's unfolding story, a story in which every life, no matter how hidden, contributes to the beauty of the whole. And so the woman who walks alone with no husband walks not in darkness, but in the light of a deeper understanding of vision that sees beyond the temporal to the eternal, and in that vision she finds her strength, her purpose, and her joy.